What happens when we begin to realize that the 200-year experiment we've called the American healthcare system has failed? Tune in to Awakened Wellness with Mylène Riobe, MD, and join the conversation about how to heal our broken system to reverse our current health crisis. The entire world is looking for answers, and the truth is hidden in plain sight. Learn how spirituality, ancient traditions, and cutting-edge science are merging to create a new paradigm of wellness. Every Tuesday at 11 a.m. and 11 p.m. with live shows on the first and third mornings when you can call in and ask the questions that matter most to you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Awakened Wellness with Mylène Riobe, MD. I'm your host, Dr. Mylène. And today we're going to be exploring the Extraordinary Egg Controversy. Another egg study has been released, is as confusing as ever. And so we'll begin to explore, why are we always getting these conflicting studies from our conventional medical model studies? They told us to eat eggs, then they told us not to eat eggs. And then they told us to eat eggs again, and now they're telling us not to eat eggs again. And so how are we supposed to parse through all this data to figure out what we can eat here in the United States? And just as I was preparing for this show, an aspirin study came out yesterday. And so if we have time left today, we'll go ahead and discuss the aspirin controversy as well. And what I think the common thread will be is that, unfortunately, here in the U.S. and in our conventional medical model, we tend to alter things. We tend to not keep them in their natural states, and then we begin to scratch our heads and wonder why people get sick and people die when we do this. And hopefully at some point we'll begin to see the common threads, look at them more critically so that we can provide important and useful information to our clients, to our population at large, to our children. What do we tell our kids to eat? Do we tell them to eat eggs, or do we tell them not to eat eggs? Well, today we're going to figure this out. I'm going to help you parse through all of this confusing information so that you can begin to take a critical look at the information that you're given through the news, through medical studies even, so that you can be a little less confused by the end of today's show. So today we'll be debunking myths, learning about cutting-edge research, corroborating ancient medical systems, and exploring the mind-body-spirit approaches that keep you and your family vibrant, healthy, and happy, regardless of what you hear on the news. So I'd like to stress that what I'll be discussing on our show doesn't constitute medical advice because I'm not specifically evaluating and treating any particular person or condition on the show. My patients who come to see me at the Riobe Institute are fully and properly evaluated before I formulate a treatment plan to share with them. So I also advise you to seek the care of a board-certified integrative medical doctor to see which of the areas I'll be sharing throughout the show may benefit you. I'm blessed and I'm honored to be with you here today on Dream Vision 7 Radio. We're live today, March 19th, 2019. We're live every first and third Tuesday morning at 11 a.m. with our pre-recorded shows on the second and fourth Tuesday mornings at 11. You can also hear our pre-recorded shows every Tuesday night at 11 p.m. right here on Dream Vision 7 Radio. During our live shows, I encourage you to call with your questions at area code 833-220-1200. Again, that's 833-220-1200. I'd love to hear from you, questions and comments. I know, unfortunately, our news can be extremely confusing. I'd like to do my best to answer any questions you may have today, so please feel free to give us a call. So this week, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a study on eggs. And after having removed the ban on eggs, they put it back up after this particular study. And if you look at the study superficially, it sounds very convincing. Basically what they found is the consumption of 300 milligrams of cholesterol or more per day increases the risk of cardiovascular disease by 17%. What they found is consumption of 300 milligrams or more of cholesterol per day increases your risk of all-cause death by 18%. All-cause death means death for any particular reason, whether it be a car accident to a heart attack. So if you consume more than 2 eggs per day, you have a 17% higher risk of developing heart disease, according to this study, and you have an 18% risk of dying for any particular reason, or increased risk, I should say. So let's look at the study a little bit more carefully, right? So again, if you read the comments on the study, this says that it's very convincing, and what they did was that they controlled for diet. In other words, everybody had the same exact diet, and the only thing that differed was how many eggs they ate. Unfortunately, when you actually look at the study, this was not, in fact, the case. What they did was they took several thousand patients. There are almost 20,000 patients in this study, so it's a large study. 30,000 patients. So it was a very large study. And what they did was they followed these people for up to 31 years. So they took 6 different studies, pooled all the data into one study. Up to 30,000 patients were followed for up to 31 years. So on its face, it sounds, again, very convincing. But unfortunately, here's where they went wrong. So what they did was they took these patients and they asked them to recall what they ate for the previous month or even year. And then they started to follow them for 31 years with the assumption that their diet would not change for the next 30 years. Now, I don't know about you, but I can barely remember what I had for breakfast this morning, and it's only 11 a.m. And so imagine if someone came to me and asked me to remember what I had eaten for the entire previous month or perhaps year. We can all assume that we would pretty much be making things up, right? We would give a general indication of what we tend to eat. It certainly would not have any precision associated with it. And so this is the data that they took from people, and then they watched them for 31 years, never again asking them what they ate. And then they looked to see if these people had heart disease or heart attacks or died in the next 30 years. So when we really look at this study, we can see just how flawed it actually is. First of all, recall is very, very problematic. If they wanted to study this properly, perhaps what they should have done is had these people collect diet logs as they moved forward through the study. In other words, every time you eat something, you write down what you ate. And then you follow these people for 30-some-odd years, having them send in week after week their diet logs. But that's not what they did. They simply asked them to recall. What did you eat last year? What did you eat last month? And they took notes, and then they followed them, never again asking them any dietary questions. So that's a problem. I don't recall how many eggs per day I had over the past year or month. Now, I can tell you that generally I tend to eat 3 egg whites and 1 egg most mornings. But that doesn't mean that's what I've done, and it doesn't mean that I haven't had other sources of cholesterol or fat in my diet. It doesn't mean that I haven't eaten a bunch of sugar. It doesn't mean that I haven't eaten other foods that may be contributing to my risk of heart disease. So I have a real problem with this study, as I do most studies done by the conventional medical model. It's just not a good way to study things. So let's put this into a little bit of perspective. So what we know about the United States population is that 11% of us have some form of cardiovascular disease. So this study tells us that we're going to have a 17% higher risk if we consume 300 milligrams of cholesterol or more per day. So that's basically 2 eggs or more per day. If we look at our population, somewhere between 20% of us and 74% of us have what's called small bowel bacterial overgrowth. And I've done a podcast about this before in my podcast called Gut Check. I think this is way more important than eggs. Small bowel bacterial overgrowth or small intestine bacterial overgrowth is a very, very serious infection of the small bowel, which goes unrecognized by the conventional medical model, but is essentially an epidemic throughout the United States. So if you eat 2 or more eggs per day, according to the Journal of the American Medical Association, you have a 17% higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease. According to the Cleveland Clinic, if you have a small bowel bacterial overgrowth, you have an astounding 80%, that's 80% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So what's more important, worrying about whether or not you have a small bowel infection or worrying about how many eggs you eat per day? So 17% versus 80%. So are we focused in the right place here? I don't think so. So if you ask most conventional medical doctors, they do not believe in small bowel infections. But the Cleveland Clinic does, as does Johns Hopkins University, probably the premier medical institution in the United States. In 2014, they conducted a study on SIBO, or small bowel infection, and they noted that herbal therapies were actually better than antibiotics for its treatment. So they very much believe in SIBO, and they're studying it, as is the Cleveland Clinic. So is there a link between SIBO and egg consumption? Can we figure out why eggs might be a little bit dangerous to some people and not to others? So Cleveland Clinic concluded that they think that the risk of cardiovascular disease might be associated with the digestion of choline, which is an amino acid. Choline is basically brain food. It's extremely important as it converts to acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter that keeps our brains and nervous system functioning. So when you have a small bowel infection, you cannot process choline appropriately, and it gets converted to a substance called trimethylalanine, or TMA, which gets further converted to trimethylalanine N-oxide, or TMAO, in the liver. This is strongly correlated with atherosclerosis, or cardiovascular disease, basically. Eggs are a very rich source of choline. Choline is found in egg yolks. And so if you happen to have SIBO and you eat eggs, that might be causing a major problem for you and might be increasing your risk of cardiovascular disease. And that may be part of the reason, at least, why these egg studies are so inconclusive. So if we know that 3 out of every 4 people who have any type of gastrointestinal symptoms have a small bowel infection, that would explain a lot in terms of whether or not you eating eggs might increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. We know that eggs are not dangerous. We know that nature doesn't really create foods for broad consumption that are toxic, right? Nature does produce toxins. It produces arsenic, for example. And of course, if you consume arsenic in large amounts, that's toxic. You would die. Nature does have toxins within itself. Snake venom, for example, is toxic. But that's used as a protective and defensive mechanism, not as a food. So why would nature produce a toxic food? That doesn't really make a lot of sense. So when we begin to suspect that a food is toxic, we have to look at what may have we done to this food to have made it toxic. Unfortunately, in our conventional model, we assume it's the food, but in the integrative medical model, we assume it's what we've done to the food. So soy is a good example. Soy is eaten in Asia by the truckloads, and Asia does not have the cancer risk that we do here in the United States. And yet we demonize soy here in the United States and say that it increases the risk of cancer. Well, is it the soy or is it the genetic modification of the soy? Right? I would put my money on the genetic modification of the soy that made it toxic. Because, again, soy is consumed in large amounts in Asia, and they have a fraction of our risk of cancer.